Hook. He was a Marine with only one final wish before he died. And when he shared it, Donald Trump and Melania couldn't hold back their tears. This is not about politics, it's about sacrifice, legacy, and a story every American needs to hear. Stay with me, and before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let's honor a hero together. It started with silence. A large crowd had gathered, flags waving in the soft breeze, but the moment a decorated Marine stepped forward, the noise of the world seemed to fade away. Donald Trump and Melania, seated at the front, leaned forward. The Marine's face carried scars of war, not all visible, but the weight of his story was clear even before he spoke. The man introduced himself as Daniel Carter, a Marine who had served the United States for more than 20 years. His voice was strong, but beneath it was a heaviness that only those who had walked through war could understand. He explained that he wasn't there to brag about medals or victories. He was there to speak a truth that most people never hear. Daniel spoke about his time in service, about the places he had been, the battles he had faced, and the brothers he had lost. He said he had carried fellow soldiers on his shoulders and carried memories even heavier in his heart. The crowd grew quieter with each word, realizing this was more than just a speech. It was a confession of a soldier who had given his life to his country in ways no one could see. He told them that the battles didn't end when the war did. Soldiers carried scars no one noticed, scars that stayed long after the uniforms were taken off. "People thank us for our service," Daniel said, "but they don't see the battles we keep fighting every single day. The sleepless nights, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, the pain that never goes away." His words struck deep. Even Trump, a man known for his strong and commanding presence, lowered his gaze. Melania pressed her lips together and folded her hands, her eyes soft with sympathy. Then Daniel told the story of his best friend, Sergeant Miller. They had trained together, laughed together, and fought side by side. On one mission overseas, Miller didn't make it home. Daniel's voice trembled as he recalled that day. He said he promised Miller that if he survived, he would tell his story to the world, to remind everyone what true sacrifice looked like. The crowd held its breath, listening to a promise made on the battlefield, a promise that Daniel was now keeping. And then came the moment that changed everything. Daniel revealed that his time was short. Because of chemical exposure during his years of service, he had developed an illness that doctors now told him was in its final stage. "I don't know how much time I have left," he admitted, his voice breaking for the first time. The weight of those words fell over the gathering like a heavy cloud. Trump sat back in his chair, visibly moved, while Melania brought her hand to her heart. For the first time, the event was no longer about politics, speeches, or appearances. It was about a man whose life was measured in weeks, not years, and whose courage extended beyond the battlefield into this final moment. Then Daniel gave his last wish. He said he didn't want a parade and he didn't want his name carved into stone. "My wish is simple," he said. "Never forget. Teach the children that freedom is not free. Remember the soldiers who still fight invisible battles every day. Honor the fallen who gave everything so that we could be here today, living free." His voice cracked and tears filled his eyes, but his message was stronger than ever. Veterans in the audience stood and saluted. Mothers hugged their children. Many wiped away tears they couldn't hold back. Trump slowly stood, walked to Daniel, and placed a hand on his shoulder. There was no long speech, no political message, just a simple, powerful sentence. "Because of men like you, America stands strong. We will never forget." The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the applause of politics. It was the applause of gratitude, respect, and love. Melania leaned close to Daniel and whispered something quietly, words only he could hear, but her expression told the story. Her respect was genuine, her gratitude sincere. Daniel stood tall, though his body was weak. For a moment, he looked like the Marine he had always been, proud, unshaken, carrying the memory of every brother he had lost. The crowd cheered, veterans saluted, and children waved their flags. Everyone there knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's words spread across the country. His story was shared online, in news outlets, and in homes. Millions who had never met him repeated his message. His last wish was already coming true. Trump and Melania's tears that day were not just for Daniel. They were for every soldier who carried scars the world could not see, for every family who had lost a loved one, and for every name etched into history by sacrifice. Daniel Carter may have known his time was short, but he left behind a legacy far greater than time itself. His story was no longer his alone. It belonged to a nation that would remember. "My name is Daniel Carter," he began, voice steady yet heavy. "I served this country for 22 years. I've seen battles that most people only read about in books. I've seen brothers fall, and I've carried memories that will never leave me." The crowd listened closely. Trump adjusted his tie. Melania folded her hands, both showing the rare stillness that comes only when someone knows they're about to hear something unforgettable. Daniel Carter wasn't there for applause or recognition. He wasn't there to speak of politics or pride. He was there to tell a story that was carved into him through pain, loyalty, and sacrifice. The Marine stood tall, though his frame showed signs of the years that had passed and the weight of memories that clung to him. His voice, though calm, carried an intensity that pulled every listener in. He began speaking about the places he had been, the missions no one in the audience would ever truly understand, and the moments that still played in his mind as if they happened yesterday. He spoke of the chaos of war, the endless nights, and the brothers who laughed with him one moment and were gone the next. "War doesn't end when the fighting stops," he said. "It comes home with you. It sits with you in silence. It follows you in your dreams. And it never truly lets go." The words landed heavily on everyone present. Trump, usually a man who carried himself with firmness and confidence, leaned forward, his expression softened. Melania's eyes reflected compassion as she clasped her hands tightly. The crowd was frozen in place, every word reaching deep into their hearts. Daniel then told them about Sergeant Miller, his closest friend in service. Together they had faced storms, deserts, and fire. They had shared jokes to ease the tension before missions and shared fears when the night was too quiet. But during one operation, Miller was taken by a blast that Daniel survived. "That day broke me," Daniel said, his voice trembling for the first time. "I carried his body, but I've carried his memory ever since. I promised him if I ever had the chance, I'd tell people about him. I'd tell the world that freedom isn't free, and it comes with names, faces, and families left behind." The audience's silence was so intense that even the wind seemed to pause. Veterans in the crowd wiped their eyes. Parents pulled their children closer, as if the words were a lesson no classroom could ever teach. Then Daniel revealed the hardest truth of all. He was sick. Exposure to chemicals during his years of service had left him battling a terminal illness. The doctors had told him his time was limited. "I don't know how many more days I have left," he admitted. The weight of his confession filled the air like thunder. Trump sat back, visibly shaken, while Melania lifted her hand to her heart. This was no longer a speech. It was a farewell, a legacy being passed on. "My last wish," Daniel continued, his voice breaking yet filled with resolve, "is not for myself. I don't need my name carved in stone, and I don't need monuments. My wish is for this nation to remember. Remember the fallen, remember the families, remember the veterans who fight invisible battles every day. Teach the children that freedom has a price, and that price is paid with lives, with blood, and with sacrifice." Tears flowed freely in the crowd now. Veterans rose to their feet and saluted. Strangers held hands. Even those who didn't know Daniel personally felt his story touch their souls. The Marine, though visibly weakened, stood taller, as if Miller himself and countless others stood with him in that moment. Trump slowly rose from his seat, walked to Daniel, and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. For once, the man known for his strong voice and long speeches said only a few words. "Because of men like you," Trump said softly, "America stands strong. We will never forget." Melania stepped forward too, whispering something private to Daniel, her eyes glistening. The Marine nodded, his expression both proud and grateful. The crowd erupted into applause. But it wasn't the applause of politics. It was the applause of respect, love, and unity. It was for every soldier who had given their all, and for one Marine who used his final days to remind the world of what true sacrifice means. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's story traveled far beyond that room. Clips of his speech spread across social media and television. Millions of people who had never met him now carried his words in their hearts. His wish had already come true. America was remembering. Daniel Carter may have known his time was short, but his legacy would live forever. His story wasn't about war alone. It was about brotherhood, sacrifice, and the simple truth that freedom is never free. And as Trump and Melania wiped away tears that day, it was clear that Daniel's voice would echo far beyond his final breath, reminding generations of the price of liberty. Daniel wasn't there to talk about medals or honor. He was there to share truth. He spoke of sleepless nights, of pain that lingered far beyond the battlefield. People thank us for our service, he said, but what they don't see are the battles that never end, the ones inside our minds. His words cut deep. Even Trump, known for his commanding presence, lowered his gaze for a moment. Melania's eyes softened. The audience could feel that what they were witnessing wasn't a speech. It was a confession from a man who had carried too much for too long. Daniel explained that war had a way of never leaving you. The battles might end overseas, but they followed soldiers home. They arrived in the middle of the night in the form of nightmares. They whispered in quiet rooms when memories replayed like broken records, and they sat heavy on the shoulders of veterans trying to return to normal lives. Every day feels like another mission, he said. Not out there in the desert. Not in foreign cities, but right here, in my mind, in my home, when no one else can see it. The crowd was still, the kind of stillness that only comes when truth reaches straight into the heart. Parents who had brought their children held them tighter. Veterans in the audience nodded silently, many of them understanding exactly what Daniel meant. His words spoke for them, for every soldier who fought invisible wars that families, neighbors, and strangers never saw. Then Daniel's voice softened. He spoke about moments of silence after the battlefield, when he sat alone wondering why he survived while others didn't. He told them about the guilt of walking away when friends did not, about the weight of being the one who returned home while others were laid to rest far from their families. That guilt never leaves you, he admitted, his voice breaking just slightly. You carry it, not because you want to, but because it reminds you of the cost of freedom. Trump shifted slightly, his jaw tight, but his expression showed respect. Melania's eyes were fixed on Daniel, her face reflecting the compassion of someone listening not as a first lady, but as a human being moved by another's pain. Daniel then shared something personal, something that left the audience breathless. He explained that his body carried more than memories. It carried damage. Years of exposure to chemicals and conditions during his service had left him sick, and the doctors had given him news no soldier wanted to hear. His fight was coming to an end. He didn't know how much longer he had. The crowd gasped softly, many covering their mouths as the truth settled in. This Marine wasn't just sharing his story. He was giving them his farewell. Yet even in that moment, Daniel didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't ask for recognition. Instead, he asked for one thing: remembrance. My last wish, he said, steadying his voice, is that you never forget us. Don't forget the ones who never came home. Don't forget the families who still wait, and the soldiers who fight battles no one can see. Teach the children what sacrifice really means. Show them that freedom isn't free. It is earned every day by men and women who give everything. The silence broke as tears filled the eyes of those listening. Veterans stood slowly and saluted. Families held each other. Even strangers reached out to comfort those beside them. Daniel's words were no longer just his. They belonged to everyone present, to everyone who would hear his story afterward. Trump rose from his seat, his steps slow and deliberate. He placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder and, in a rare moment of quiet emotion, said only one sentence. Because of men like you, America will never forget. It was brief, but powerful. Words spoken not from a stage, but from one man to another. The crowd erupted into applause. The kind that comes not from excitement, but from deep respect. Melania leaned toward Daniel, whispering something softly, her eyes wet with tears. Her words weren't for the cameras, but for him, an expression of gratitude from the heart. Daniel stood as tall as his weakening body allowed. For a brief moment, he looked like the Marine he had always been, proud, strong, unshaken. Around him, the applause carried on, echoing like a promise. His story, his pain, his wish, they would not be forgotten. And though his time was short, his message would live on, carried by everyone who heard it that day, and by millions more who would hear it in the days to come. The Marine then told the story of his closest friend, Sergeant Miller. They had trained together, laughed together, and fought side by side. In one tragic mission overseas, Miller didn't make it back. That day, Daniel said, I promised him something. I promised that if I ever had the chance, I would tell the world what he meant to me and what every fallen soldier means to this nation. The crowd went still, and a lump formed in the throats of everyone listening. Daniel paused for a moment, his eyes glistening with the kind of pain that never fades. He explained that Miller wasn't just a fellow Marine, he was like a brother. They had shared meals in the middle of nowhere, jokes before dangerous missions, and dreams of what life might look like after the war. We talked about home, Daniel continued, his voice breaking slightly. About the families we wanted, the peace we hoped for, the futures we would build. But for Miller, that future never came, and I have carried that weight every single day. The audience was silent. Even the children in the crowd, who might not have fully understood the depth of his words, sensed the gravity of the moment. Veterans in uniform bowed their heads, some fighting back tears as Daniel's story reminded them of faces they too had lost. It was no longer just his story, it was theirs as well. Daniel then explained how, after Miller's death, he had lived with guilt. I survived, but he didn't. I came home, but he never got the chance. I often asked myself, why him and not me? What made me worthy of coming back when he gave everything? He took a deep breath before continuing. That's when I made a promise. I promised I'd speak his name and the names of every soldier like him, because the world should never forget. Trump, seated at the front, leaned forward. His expression, usually firm and unshaken, now showed a softness rarely seen. Melania's eyes were locked on Daniel, her lips pressed together, her hands folded tightly as if holding in her own emotion. Daniel went on to say that Miller's story was just one of thousands. Every fallen soldier had a story, a dream, a family waiting back home. When we talk about sacrifice, we cannot just speak in numbers, Daniel said firmly. We must remember that behind every flag-draped coffin is a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a friend. Each one gave up a lifetime so that we could live ours. The weight of those words pressed down on the audience. Some people reached for tissues. Others closed their eyes and bowed their heads. The Marine's promise to his friend had become a promise to them as well, a promise that those sacrifices would not fade into silence. Daniel's voice trembled as he added, I live with Miller's memory every day. When I wake up, I remember his laugh. When I see his picture, I remember his courage. And when I look at this flag, our flag, I remember what it cost him. That is why I speak. That is why I will never stop. The crowd rose to its feet, not in excitement, but in deep respect. Veterans stood at attention and saluted. Mothers hugged their children closer. Even strangers held one another's hands. It was a moment of unity, created by one Marine's promise to a fallen brother. Trump slowly stood, walked toward Daniel, and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. His words were brief but heavy with meaning. We will remember him. And we will remember you. Melania's eyes shimmered as she nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that Sergeant Miller's story would now live far beyond that room. Daniel straightened his posture as much as his tired body allowed. For that moment, he was not just a man speaking about loss. He was a Marine standing strong for every brother and sister who had laid down their lives. His voice may have been unsteady, but his promise was unbreakable. And as the applause filled the room, echoing like a vow, everyone knew one thing. Sergeant Miller would never be forgotten, and neither would the countless others who had given their all. Then Daniel's voice trembled. I'm not here today for applause or recognition. I'm here because my time is running out. The doctors have told me that my illness, caused by what I was exposed to during service, has reached its final stage. A hush spread across the room. Trump sat back, visibly shaken, while Melania pressed a hand to her heart. The Marine's words hit like thunder, raw, painful, and undeniable. The audience froze, as though the very air had thickened around them. A few people gasped, others clasped their hands tightly together, and some lowered their eyes, unwilling to imagine the reality Daniel was facing. He had survived years of war, but now he was fighting a battle no training could prepare him for. This was a fight against time, and it was one he knew he could not win. Daniel lifted his gaze, scanning the crowd. When I put on this uniform, I accepted that I might not come home from war, he said. But I never thought the war would follow me back, hidden in the very air I breathed and the ground I walked on. It didn't take me down in combat, it waited. And now, it's here to finish the job." His words sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. He paused, his breath catching slightly, before continuing. "I've lived long enough to know that the measure of a man's life isn't in its length, but in its impact. And if these are my last days, I don't want them wasted. I want them spent reminding you of the cost of freedom." His voice grew stronger with each word, as though the truth gave him new strength. Trump shifted forward in his seat, his usually firm demeanor cracked by emotion. Melania's eyes glistened, her hand still over her heart, as if holding back tears. The Marine was not delivering a speech anymore. He was delivering his final message, his legacy. Daniel then revealed his last wish. "I don't need my name on a monument," he said. "I don't need a parade in my honor. What I want is simple. Remember us. Remember those who came home broken, and those who never came home at all. Teach the children that freedom isn't free. Remind them that it's been paid for in blood, in lives, in dreams cut short." His voice cracked, but he pressed on, unwilling to let weakness steal the weight of his words. The audience began to shift emotionally. Mothers hugged their children tighter. Veterans saluted through tears. Even hardened men wiped their eyes, unable to remain unmoved. Daniel's truth was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone listening, a reminder etched into their hearts. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength from the memory of his fallen brothers. "Every time you see the flag," he continued, "don't just see colors on fabric. See the faces of those who gave their lives. See the sacrifices made so that you could wake up free tomorrow. That is my wish. That is my final request." The silence that followed was overwhelming. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed too loudly. Then slowly the crowd began to rise to their feet. A wave of applause broke out, powerful and unrestrained, mixed with sobs and salutes. The ovation wasn't for Daniel alone. It was for every soldier he represented, every story he carried. Trump stood and walked toward him. He placed a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder, his expression heavy with sincerity. "Because of men like you," he said quietly, "America stands strong. We will not forget." It was short, but it carried the weight of a nation. Melania leaned close, her voice soft but filled with emotion as she whispered words only Daniel could hear, though her words were private. Her face made the message clear: gratitude, compassion, and respect. Daniel straightened his shoulders, his frail body standing tall as if fueled by the strength of every Marine who had gone before him. For that moment, he wasn't a man facing the end of his life. He was a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and honor. The crowd erupted again, clapping, cheering, saluting. Some shouted, "Thank you." Others wept openly. Daniel looked out at them with tears of his own, but also with peace. His message had been heard. His promise to his brothers had been kept, and his last wish had begun to come true, even before he left this world. And so, while his time was short, his words would echo forever, through the hearts of those present, through the tears of Trump and Melania, and through every person who would hear his story and remember the price of freedom. With the weight of finality in his voice, Daniel continued, "My last wish is simple. I don't want parades. I don't want monuments. I want this country to never forget the men and women who gave everything. I want children to grow up knowing freedom isn't free. And I want every veteran, every soldier still fighting their inner battles, to know they are not alone." His voice cracked and tears glistened in his eyes. Many in the audience were already crying silently. The crowd had heard speeches before, but this wasn't a speech. It was a man's heart being laid bare. Daniel wasn't asking for himself. He wasn't asking for glory. He was giving his final gift to his nation, truth. The kind of truth that cuts deep and leaves you changed. He explained that too often, people remember veterans on one day of the year, when flags are raised and ceremonies are held. But then life goes back to normal. Families get busy. Children grow up never knowing the names of the men and women who gave them that normal life. That, Daniel said, is what I don't want. I want remembrance to live every day, in classrooms, in homes, in the hearts of our people. Trump's expression was heavy, his usual firmness softened. Melania, her hand still over her heart, looked visibly moved. Around them, parents pulled their children closer, whispering lessons they had never taught before. Veterans in the audience wiped away tears, not out of weakness, but because Daniel's words spoke for them all. He lifted his head, and though his voice trembled, his message grew stronger. When a soldier falls, a piece of this nation falls with them. When a veteran struggles alone, it is a failure of all of us. My last wish is not to be remembered as an individual, but as a reminder. A reminder that freedom demands vigilance, respect, and unity. The audience, overcome by emotion, shifted restlessly. Some clasped their hands together as if in prayer. Others nodded firmly, committing in silence to honor. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation, but this wasn't the kind of cheer reserved for politics or entertainment. It was slower, deeper, born from respect. Many veterans in the crowd saluted through tears, while families hugged their children, whispering words of gratitude. People wiped their eyes, touched by a truth that went far beyond the room they were standing in. Trump, still holding Melania's hand, turned slightly toward the audience, then back to Daniel. He stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the Marine's shoulder. For once, there was no grand speech, no rhetoric, just a simple, powerful sentence. "Because of men like you," he said, voice low and heavy with meaning, "America will never forget." Those words were met with another round of applause, louder and more emotional than before. It was as if the entire audience wanted to echo the promise, to reassure Daniel that his final wish would not fade. His story, his sacrifice, and the memory of his brothers in arms would live on. Melania leaned closer, whispering something softly into Daniel's ear. Though her words were private, the emotion on her face made the meaning clear. Gratitude, compassion, respect. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes moist but his expression strong. The Marine, standing between a former president and First Lady, looked out at the crowd. For a moment he didn't see the tears, the salutes, or the applause. He saw his friend Sergeant Miller. He saw the faces of those who didn't make it home. And he knew that by speaking his truth here today, he had kept his promise to them. The crowd's applause rolled on, like waves crashing against the shore. Some shouted, "Thank you." Others wept openly. Children waved flags, their young faces filled with a new kind of understanding. Daniel had done what he set out to do. He had reminded a nation of the cost of freedom, and he had secured the vow that the fallen would never be forgotten. Trump and Melania's tears were not just for Daniel, but for every soldier he represented. In that moment, it didn't matter what side of politics anyone stood on. What mattered was the truth of sacrifice, the reality of loss, and the power of remembrance. Daniel straightened his posture, his body weak, but his spirit unbroken. For that moment, he wasn't a man nearing the end of his life. He was a Marine standing tall, delivering a final message of unity, sacrifice, and honor. And as the applause thundered on, Daniel Carter knew that his words would echo far beyond that room, across the nation, across generations, carried by the very people who had promised him, in their hearts, that they would never forget. What happened next was unforgettable. The crowd, unable to hold back, rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. Veterans saluted, mothers hugged their children, and strangers wiped away tears. The Marine, weak but proud, straightened his shoulders as if carrying all the voices of the fallen with him. His wish had already begun to take root. People would remember. The sound of the applause was unlike anything that room had ever held before. It wasn't the loud cheer of excitement. It was heavy, emotional, and filled with gratitude. Every clap carried the weight of memories, of stories untold, of families missing someone at their dinner table. It was the kind of sound that shakes the soul. Daniel Carter, standing at the center of it all, took in the faces before him. He saw veterans with tears streaming down their cheeks, their hands raised in salute. He saw parents whispering to their children, teaching them in that moment what sacrifice truly means. He saw strangers embracing, united not by politics or opinion, but by the raw truth of his words. His body was failing him, but his spirit had never been stronger. Trump and Melania stood as well, side by side, their presence marked by silence and respect. Trump's usual commanding demeanor was replaced with humility. He didn't need to say anything. The way he looked at Daniel spoke louder than words. Melania's eyes shimmered with tears, and as she held her husband's hand, she looked at the Marine with a gaze that carried both admiration and sorrow. Daniel slowly raised his hand in a small, trembling salute. The crowd erupted even louder, as though the gesture had released a flood of emotion. It was no longer just applause for one man. It was applause for every soldier whose story had never been told, for every name written on a gravestone, For every family who had carried grief in silence. As the cheers echoed, Daniel spoke once more, his voice soft but carried across the room by the power of silence. This is what I wanted, he said, pausing as emotion caught in his throat. Not for me, but for them. For every brother and sister who never made it home. For every veteran who thinks they are forgotten. For every family who has carried the burden alone. Today, you proved they are remembered. The audience fell quiet again, his words sinking deep into their hearts. Some nodded firmly, committing to hold on to the promise he had asked for. Others wiped their eyes, realizing that they were not just spectators. They were now part of the vow to remember. Trump stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. He leaned in and said something quietly. Words meant only for the Marine. But whatever was said, Daniel nodded, his lips trembling into a faint smile. Melania stepped closer too, her expression soft and sincere, and she whispered her own private words of thanks. Daniel looked out at the crowd once more, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. He stood straighter, stronger, as though lifted by the spirits of every fallen soldier who walked with him in memory. His eyes swept across the room, locking onto the flags being held by children in the front row. His voice rose once more, fragile yet unbreakable. Promise me, he said. Promise me you will keep telling their stories. Promise me you will never let their names fade away. And without hesitation the crowd answered, not with words, but with another roar of applause, with tears, with salutes, with hearts that silently vowed to carry his message forward. In that moment his wish had become theirs. The ovation seemed to go on forever. It wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning of remembrance, of unity, of a new awareness of the sacrifices carried by those who wore the uniform. Daniel had come to give his last message, and in return, he had ignited something that would outlive him. As the crowd finally began to settle, Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, a look of peace crossing his face. He had done it. His mission, his promise was fulfilled. And though his days were numbered, he knew that his story, and the stories of his fallen brothers and sisters, would live on. His voice might fade, but the echo of that day would never be forgotten. The applause faded. Trump stepped forward and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. He didn't give a long speech. He simply said, America will remember because of men like you. Melania whispered softly, your story will live on. In that moment, politics, fame, and power faded away. What remained was humanity. One man's courage reminding a nation of its debt to those who serve. The crowd, still standing, held its breath. Many expected Trump to speak longer, to deliver one of his signature remarks, but instead he chose silence, letting the Marine's story remain at the center. That choice alone spoke volumes. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is to listen, to honor, and to acknowledge the sacrifice of someone far greater in spirit than in title. Daniel, standing tall despite the frailty of his body, met Trump's eyes. He saw not a politician in that moment, but a man, another American, acknowledging his truth. When Melania leaned closer and whispered her words, the Marine closed his eyes briefly, almost as if sealing that promise into his heart. For years he had carried the memories of fallen brothers, but now he had the comfort of knowing that his story, too, would be carried forward. The audience shifted, many wiping tears, others whispering to their children about the importance of what they had just witnessed. Parents pointed at Daniel, reminding their sons and daughters that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear uniforms and carry scars, seen and unseen. Veterans in the crowd stood straighter, feeling a renewed sense of recognition. For them, this wasn't just about Daniel. It was about all of them. Trump and Melania stepped back slightly, allowing Daniel to stand in the center of the moment. It wasn't about politics, it wasn't about parties, it was about people. And at the core of it all was Daniel's courage, a courage not defined by battlefield victories, but by the honesty to speak about pain, loss, and sacrifice. Daniel lifted his chin, his voice breaking the silence once more. This is what I hoped for, he said. Not recognition for myself, but remembrance for those who never made it home. Every time a child learns what freedom costs, every time a veteran feels seen, every time a family knows their loved one's sacrifice mattered, that's when my story lives on. The words settled over the audience like a soft blanket, heavy with meaning yet comforting in their clarity. People nodded, some whispering, Amen. others clutching the hands of loved ones. In that moment, Daniel was not just a Marine. He was a teacher, a reminder, a symbol of a nation's debt to those who serve. Trump gave a small nod, one that carried more sincerity than 1,000 speeches. Melania's hand remained near her heart, her expression tender, as though she were memorizing the Marine's face and words. Together they embodied what many in the audience felt, that no amount of power or prestige outweighs the quiet, unshakable courage of those who serve and sacrifice. As Daniel stood there, the room once again filled with quiet applause. It was softer this time, not thunderous like before, but steadier, deeper, like a heartbeat. It wasn't just applause for a man. It was applause for a promise that his words, his story, and his final wish would not fade into silence. He took one last look around, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. He saw veterans saluting, children waving flags, mothers wiping tears, and strangers united in gratitude. His heart, though heavy with the knowledge of his limited time, felt lighter in that moment. His mission had been accomplished. His voice had been heard, and as the lights in the hall dimmed slightly, signaling the end of the event, Daniel knew something with certainty. He had not spoken in vain. His words had found a home in the hearts of those who listened, and his story would ripple outward, touching countless more who would hear it in the days to come. Trump's hand remained on his shoulder a moment longer before he let go. Melania gave a gentle nod, her eyes meeting Daniel's one final time. No cameras, no speeches, no headlines could capture the truth of that moment. It was simple. It was human. It was unforgettable. Daniel's story didn't end there. Weeks later, his words spread across social media, news outlets, and living rooms across the country. Millions who never knew him now carried his message in their hearts. And though his time was short, his legacy was eternal. Trump and Melania's tears weren't just for Daniel. They were for every soldier, every sacrifice, and every story that deserved to be heard. Clips of Daniel's speech were shared online, reaching people far beyond the hall where he had stood. Veterans reposted his words with captions like, "This is what we live with every day." Teachers played the recording in classrooms, using his story to show children the true meaning of sacrifice. Families sat together at dinner tables, replaying the video, their voices hushed as they explained what it meant to serve a country. Daniel had wanted remembrance, and now, remembrance was alive in the hearts of millions. News outlets covered his story, not as just another event, but as a reminder of the human side of service. Anchors grew emotional as they spoke about his final wish, and viewers across the nation found themselves reflecting on the freedoms they often took for granted. "He didn't ask for monuments or parades," one journalist said. "He asked for us to remember, and that is something every one of us can do." In small towns and big cities alike, people began holding their own acts of remembrance. Communities gathered at parks, schools held moments of silence, and veterans groups organized candlelight vigils in Daniel's honor. His face and his voice became symbols of a message larger than himself. He was not just one Marine telling his story. He had become the voice of all who served silently, of all who had given their lives without recognition. Trump and Melania, who had stood with him in his final public appearance, were also moved deeply. Weeks later, Trump mentioned Daniel in a speech, reminding the audience of his words. "My last wish is simple, never forget." Melania, in her own quiet way, spoke about him when meeting with families of veterans, telling them she had heard firsthand the bravery of a man who carried not only his own burdens, but the weight of countless others. And yet, Daniel's legacy was not just about leaders repeating his name. It was about ordinary people taking his words into their daily lives. Parents explained to their children why the flag mattered. Strangers reached out to veterans, simply saying, "Thank you, and you're not forgotten." Small acts of kindness sparked by Daniel's story began to ripple through communities. For the veterans who watched his video, his words carried a special weight. Many who had felt isolated suddenly realized they were not alone. Online forums filled with messages like, "Daniel spoke for all of us," and "Because of him, I finally feel seen." Men and women who had carried silent struggles found comfort in knowing that their pain had been acknowledged, that someone had spoken their truth on a stage big enough for the world to hear. Daniel's time on Earth was coming to a close, but his mission had been completed. He had promised his fallen brother Sergeant Miller that he would speak his name, and in doing so, he spoke for all who had been lost. He had wanted children to grow up knowing that freedom came with a price, and now children across America were hearing his story. He had wanted veterans to know they were not alone, and now, thousands felt a renewed sense of connection. His final wish had been fulfilled, not by monuments of stone, but by living monuments in people's hearts. And that was the kind of legacy no illness, no passing of time could erase. In the end, Daniel Carter became more than a Marine, more than a veteran, more than a man facing his final days. He became a symbol, a reminder that the truest form of heroism is not in seeking glory, but in speaking truth. And as his story continued to spread, his voice echoed far beyond his lifetime, carried by a nation that had promised never to forget. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Now let's honor a Marine's final wish, the moment that moved Donald Trump and Melania to tears.